Think20 or T20, one of engagement groups of the Indonesia's G20 presidency, had held comprehensive discussion and analysis on global challenges to provide policy recommendations at the G20 summits.
One of the engagement groups of the Indonesia's G20 presidency is Think20 or T20, initiated in 2012 during the Mexico's G20 presidency. The T20 plays a role as the idea bank for a multitude of experts, researchers and policymakers to providing recommendations for the G20. The Indonesia Think20 activities began since the presidency handover from Italy in November 2021. This year's T20 Summit was held in Nusa Dua, Bali on the 5th and 6th September with the theme Strengthening the Role of the G20 to Navigate the Current Global Dynamics. The Think20 has 9 task forces assigned to discuss issues in more details, such as task number 2, which is tasked with the digital connectivity, cybersecurity, and empowerment discussion. Task Force 3, which focused on climate targets, energy transition, and environmental protection, and Task Force 9 on global cooperation for sustainable development goals financing. The result of the T20 summit are in the form of task force notes that will be submitted at the G20 Leaders Summit.
Think20 or T20 is an engagement group under the G20 which focuses on research and studies by gathering knowledge from global experts and researchers. The discussion in the T20 are crucial to provide recommendations to the world leaders and policymakers. This year's Think20 Summit was held on 5 to 6 September and produced a communique on sustainable development goals and finance. In order to know more about the T20, coordinator Bryan Zaharias have joined us at the studio to discuss global cooperation for SDGs financing. Hello, Mr. Bryan, and welcome to Tvri World studio here in Nusa Dua, Bali. First to begin, tell us more about T20 and its role in the G20 meetings.
Yes, so T20 Indonesia is actually a bank of ideas. It is an official engagement group within the G20 presidency. So we're trying to give independent support to the G20 Indonesian's presidency now by giving the policy recommendation based on the research that we're doing. So we have gathered a lot of policy briefs from all the think tanks around the world, around the G20 countries, especially within the 3 specific issues. So yeah, we're trying to have the policy briefs and also to put it into the communique.
Elaborate more, Mr. Bryan, about 3 specific issues.
Yeah, so we're focusing on first the energy transition, in which also being part of the G20 Indonesia issues as well and main priority, and also the digital transformation. We're focusing on 2 main issues in this digital transformation, which are the digital divide and also the data protection. And the third one is, of course, since we are still in the pandemic era, we're trying to focus on fostering the recovery. So we're looking at several macroeconomics indicators and also, all the things that relates to the recovery itself.
Pak Bryan, in 2015, United Nations issued the so-called Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, to allow more inclusive growth that can be enjoyed by people from all walks of life and be more friendly to our Mother Earth. In one of its policy brief, the T20 argued that to achieve SDGs targets by 2030, countries worldwide need to move away from using GDP as the epic measure of success. Could you elaborate the rationale?
So I think to calculate the measure of success itself, many of economists using the GDP as the measurement of, indicates whether the country is success or not. Now within this policy brief from our Taskforce9, we emphasize more on how to use the inclusive wealth. So not only that you use the GDP as the measures of growth, but also other indicators such as the health indicators, more the environment issues as well, and also the education. So we somehow try to provide more recommendation to the government side that you cannot just focus on GDP, on the growth, and using the fossil fuels and so on, but also taking into account more of the inclusive wealth in this case, and trying to see from the individual well-being, not only about the growth of the GDP itself.
But Bryan, what will it take to change the decades-long framework of prioritizing GDP and to shift to more sustainable goals?
I think we can start step by step in this case, because Indonesia is still a developing countries, and we are used to use this GDP as a measurement. First, we can use the approach to the government statistic officials, in this case the BPS, to acknowledge more on the indicators within the inclusive wealth, within the moving beyond GDP, as I already mentioned. So it's not always about the growth and also about the GDP itself. And the second, we trying to work with the official statistics and to see which indicators that more represent the growth and economic inclusive well-being itself. So it's more on the calculation of the measurements itself, not only about the GDP growth, but also other indicators. And we then push to the government officials, to those who take the policy recommendation, that we can now no longer use GDP or just part of it, and now more push forward to the inclusive well-being. So I think we start first with encourage more the statistic offices to use this as a policy recommendation, and then we push to the government side. So with first with the data first, and then we go to the government.
So it's a concrete action. But Bryan, should we adopt parameters such as the happiness index implemented in Bhutan? What's your suggestion?
I think it's only a part of the inclusive well-being indicators itself. Because if you look at the top 3 happiest countries in the world, there are more Nordic countries, and of course their well-being, Finland, Denmark, and I forgot what the others. So I think they are very much well-being in terms of their education and health and so on. Then they are becoming happy. So I think instead of focusing just on the happiness index, as this question suggested, then we just start focusing on the inclusive well-being itself, indicators, as I already mentioned, at least 3 basic of indicators, such as health, education, and also access to facilities to the public infrastructure, for example. Then we can use other indicators such as happiness index.
But Bryan, could you please give us an insight during the meetings of the T20?
I think the meeting went very well. We had this meeting, I think, for 3 days. We focused on those 3 specific areas within, I think, 9 task forces within the T20, and my task force was basically focused on the moving beyond GDP and also blended finance, SDGs blended finance, because we are now, trying to push forward the role of other stakeholders such as philanthropic institution, multilateral development banks, and also more private sectors to involve in the SDGs blended finance, to involve them in the achieving of the SDGs by using the blended finance. So I think the discussion went very well. We also published the T20 communique that consists of these kind of recommendations that we are trying to push to the government side.
But Bryan, what were the most difficult topic of the discussion in the T20 meeting?
In my session in the Taskforce9, we are focusing on the global cooperation in SDGs blended finance. And the meeting went very well, as I already mentioned, and one of the specific focus is on the moving beyond GDP, because we're trying to make a concrete steps and how to start, and from where we should start this moving beyond GDP and inclusive wealth. And the panelists was from the developed countries, Canada and also the US, I believe, and also Germany. So they have this kind of experience of implementing this inclusive wealth. And our task force is focusing on that. So I think that's kind of difficult discussion, but it's going somewhere, reflecting from the communique that we're producing. And now we're trying to just emphasize it to the G20 leaders.
But Bryan, circling back to SDGs with COP26 and Global Pledge to reduce carbon emission last year, do you think SDGs is an easier sell today compared with 5 years ago?
I think since 5 years ago until now, the jargon of the SDGs itself is now quite everywhere, and public can actually access it throughout the social media and so on. So I think now the sounds of SDGs it's more on everywhere. I don't think it's easier that way because it's just being in everywhere. But the main focus is how to implement this kind of policies and recommendations that government has into more concrete action on how to achieve the SDGs, because the SDGs consists of 17 goals. And it is aligned with each other. So one aspect you achieve, and the other aspect you will achieve as well. One aspect failed, and the other aspect is also failed. So it's aligned with each other, and it's making more challenging because, especially when you want to achieve something, you have to also cooperate with other countries or other stakeholders. So that's why the challenge is, more on the cooperate between each other, between each countries and also other stakeholders.
But Bryan, although there are higher and more widespread awareness on the need of environmental, social governance investment, the adoption of ESG remains lackluster, especially in Asia, where the talent pool for the people skilled in ESG theme is very limited. How can this be addressed swiftly?
Yeah, I think the ESG now is also a new trend for many companies in Indonesia, because many of investors from foreign investors seek for those companies who align or to implement this kind of ESG strategy as their business model. But then again, the challenge is from the human capital perspective. So I think when we're talking about human capital, it also relates to the education system, and also how it also relates to the how these kind of issues being taught in more education system itself. So I think, but now as the demand from the ESG sides from the company to have someone that understands what ESG is now increasing, then I think the talent should also try to adapt with the demand and try to meet the demand as well. So it relates to the education system. Nevertheless, it's also.
But Bryan, let's say company. Could you walk us through the hurdles and stumbling blocks when a company wants to transition its operation into more ESG compliant? Why should they change in the first place, and why not just do business as usual?
I think the challenge will be that one strategy of ESG cannot fit all the companies. For example, like the company that works in the sector of energy, for example, they have to have their own ESG strategy that might be not fits for those who works in the property, for example. So I think every company has their own strategy that fits with their sectors, as well as to implement them as the core business. And also the challenge is that ESG cannot be just, it has to be equal between the E, the S, and the G. Many of the companies think that ESG is also about the environment. It's more on the, how to transition to the renewable energy and so on. But you have to also count the ES side, the social side, and also the governance side. Because in the social side, you can, how to make the company can empower the social within the society, and also at the same time you can have the good governance within the company. So it has to be aligned. It has to go together for the ESG, and this is one of the most challenging things I think the company face, because sometimes the company just focus on the S side, the social side, but they forgot about the environment, the two sides, and so on.
Bryan, let's say a company has adopted ESG framework and committed to follow through with their ESG commitment, but they need massive investment to change their operation. What funding source can they tap into?
Yeah, as to my acknowledge that many of investors and foreign investors now seek for a company that implement the SDG as their core models. So I think somehow the money is there. The investors are now looking for that kind of approach on the to invest in the company that on the ESG, that implement the ESG. But it is the challenge or the issues is more on how the company prepare for them to get the money or to get the investors. So I think the money is there, but how the company prepared for the implementing the ESG.
But Bryan, if we go beyond companies, even poorer countries face more restrictive financing access. Can blended finance be part of the solution?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about the blended finance, it's it's blending from the philanthropic organization, private sectors, and also public sectors, and many stakeholders. So it is very much important for the the poorer sides, or the society that needs to be empowered. For example, we have this kind of plantation or project from the Bappenas that blended this kind of funding from both the public sectors, from the APBN, and also from the philanthropic organization, and from Zakat. It is a power plant in Jambi, for example. It's a perfect example on how you use the SDGs blended financing into more concrete, more concrete product, and to empower the society, and also the society can enjoy it. So I think it is more important for the unprivileged society for the blended finance itself.
Is it possible for what had been done in Jambi be done in other part of the world and other part in Indonesia?
Yeah, I think that's just one example of how the blended finance works, and I believe that there are so many success stories there that using blended finance as the measure, or as the way or approach to build a project here in Indonesia. Yeah. That's just one of example, and how the stakeholders work together. They put the money to the project and work together for this kind of project.
Well, Bryan, before we close our discussion for this moment, do you have anything to add? One last highlight in terms of Think20 Summit.
Yeah, I think the T20 Summit has already closed. The summit is finished 2 months ago. But now we're focusing on how to pass the legacy to the next Think20, which is in India next year. So we just want to have the smooth transition between T20 Indonesia and also in India, so they don't, doing the same thing as us this year. They just have the continuation for this T20 Indonesia. So that's what we're focusing now on, how to pass the legacy, and also we're trying to also push the recommendation to the G20 leaders. As I mentioned, that we have already communique and try to talk to the G20 Indonesia leaders, and hopefully the G20 leaders can adapt it mainly on the several issues that we're focusing on, and try to also negotiate with other countries in G20 members.
Right. Thank you, Bryan, for nice talk and
Thank
insight of the Think20 Summit. I hope you succeeded with what the Think20 Summit have been working on. Stay healthy. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much.